Welcome to today's episode of The Everyday Investor. Over the past few weeks, and for a couple more, I'm exploring the question of what is money? The theory goes, the more we can understand what money is, the better the investor that we can become. Now, we use diversification when it comes to investing, or putting our eggs into a bunch of different baskets. We do this to ensure that there's a good return to be had despite the market conditions. When bigger challenges or bigger changes are afoot, though, we do need diversification of thought. Quite often, though, we don't get that because the whole media piece and the mainstream financial piece, they're kind of connected. So it requires an occasional purposeful, shift and consideration of the views that may seem abrasive sometimes, conspiratorial or even politically incorrect in some way. For example, one of the biggest achievements that central banks and governments have made over the last 100 years or so is to convince the world that a nation-state's currency, a fiat currency, which is backed by nothing other than violence, is the same as money, which is backed by something with intrinsic value. My guest today is really well known in the macro and gold investing space, and he's going to talk to me about where to from here with inflation now that the U.S. Fed is signaling rate cuts as early as next year. Now, there are some, like today's guest, who believe that under a sound money system, governments would have to earn money, just like the rest of us do. I believe this could work well with the currency backed by Bitcoin, too. However, Peter Schiff, he's the second most well-known Bitcoin critic, and one of the largest personalities in the investing world, would disagree with that. He would believe that gold, something of value which has been used for centuries as money, will one day make a comeback as the world loses faith in not only the US dollar, but most fiat currencies in the world too. I'm really fortunate and thankful to be speaking with Peter today, and I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Peter's an expert gold commentator, co-founder of Euro-Pacific Capital. He's the author of several books, and up until recently, as you'll hear, he used to have a bank in Australia, too. Hope you enjoy the show. You're listening into the Everyday Investor Podcast. Passive investing, property investment, managed funds, and crypto. If you're an everyday person wanting to build new wealth for the new world that you're heading into, then this podcast is for you. I'm Darcy Ungaro, your host. I'm a qualified financial advisor, but I'm still learning how to invest better and teach others how to do the same. I talk with guests and cover a range of topics designed to get you to think for yourself here. But please keep in mind, this can't be considered financial advice. Be sure to do your own research here and seek qualified advice of your own before making investment decisions. If you want more information, check out the show notes in your podcast player and make sure that you've subscribed to YouTube also. Then follow The Everyday Investor on all social media channels. The NZ Everyday Investor Podcast receives support from the following partners: Easy Crypto, the safe and easy way to buy and sell crypto in New Zealand; Gorilla Technology, increasing business success through innovative and strategic IT solutions; Ungaro & Co. Financial Advice for everyday people building everyday wealth. Hope you enjoy the show. Let's get started. Today, my guest on The Everyday Investor has been a financial professional since 1987. He's written several best-selling books. He's founding member of Euro-Pacific Funds, widely recognized as an economic and financial commentator appearing on Fox News, CNN, CNBC, and now pinnacle of stardom, The Everyday Investor. Peter Schiff, a.k.a. Dr. Doom, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for hosting me on the podcast.
I'm looking forward to this chat. So we'll get started. There's a lot of stuff that I want to kind of pick your brains on. In 2008, for example, you called the financial crisis well in advance, and now you're sounding the alarm, this time with regards to the size of the U.S. debt. So I'd like to eventually get to where this ends up and your views on gold. But to start with, how did the U.S. end up owing $34 trillion?
Yeah, well, obviously the world was dumb enough to loan us the money. But, it goes back to the days where the dollar became the reserve currency. And so the world is, looking to accumulate dollars and not to just hold them in cash, but to lend them out to generate a return. And the preferential way to have done that was U.S. Treasuries, because they were the perceived safest place to loan your dollars, because the U.S. government obviously had the printing press to pay you back if the taxpayers weren't doing it. But because of that, because the world, I think, was willing to lend us money, we borrowed it. And that certainly served the interests of the politicians over the decades, because these large deficits enabled politicians to promise something for nothing, which is how politicians win elections. Voters like getting free stuff. They don't like paying for it. And so if you deliver government programs, but you don't raise taxes commensurate with the cost of those programs, then you get votes. And so what the politicians did is they borrowed a lot of money in order to provide the voters with the goodies they wanted. And that's how we got $34 trillion in debt. But, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because politicians didn't just borrow money and spend it. They actually promised voters all sorts of benefits that have never been funded. So that's still a debt. That's still a liability. Social Security, Medicare, guaranteed student loans, guaranteed mortgages, guaranteed brokerage accounts, guaranteed pensions. The U.S. government gave all these benefits to Americans, but never funded them. So if you look at the unfunded debt of the U.S. government, which is something that an accountant would look at, on an actuarially sound basis, and the real total debt of the United States is not the $34 trillion that we've borrowed, but 100, 200 trillion of debts that we've guaranteed. So right. The government is hopelessly insolvent. The entire nation is bankrupt. And it's only a question of when the world is going to acknowledge this, and then we have a real crisis.
So I guess my question around that is, who is ultimately to blame? Yeah, the politicians made these promises, but say we the people would have gladly accepted that. So is the real source of the problem we the people who aren't necessarily educated enough to really figure out what's going on?
Yeah, and they're not necessarily not educated. They're purposely brainwashed in the government school system not to understand this. But yes, you could say, at the heart, it's just the inherent flaw of democracy, that it was all inevitable. But, more specific, places to point the finger, the central bank, the Federal Reserve was particularly culpable. Obviously the members of Congress themselves, the presidents, they did vote to spend all this money. So there's certainly blame to go around. I think the Supreme Court is culpable for allowing a lot of unconstitutional expenditures to continue. So there's plenty of blame to go around. And I've been blaming all of the appropriate contributors, for a couple of decades now, but particularly over the last decade.
So in more recent history, though, so say from March 2022 to date, the Fed funds rate over there in the U.S. has been increased by around 5%. Over here in New Zealand, it's probably pretty much the same thing. But it kind of feels like the consensus amongst most commentators here in New Zealand, and from what I can understand with the U.S. as well, is that there could be a cut sometime next year with interest rates. And maybe that would explain why tech stocks and crypto are taking off potentially as a result. But what are your general views on, where the Fed might be going next?
Well, the markets expect a cut, but a cut is not warranted. In fact, the Fed should continue to hike. So should the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Rates are still too low. And the reason the Fed would be cutting rates is not because they've succeeded in returning inflation to 2%, but because the country can't afford the rates, because everybody has too much debt. In particular, the government. Next year, about $9 to $10 trillion of that $34 trillion in debt matures, which means it has to be refinanced. It's currently financed, at very low rates, and it would have to be rolled over at much, much higher rates. In addition, we're adding about $1 trillion a quarter to the national debt. So that's another $4 trillion that the government's going to need to borrow, in addition to the $9-10 trillion it's going to need to refinance. So you're looking at $13 trillion of debt. I mean, I just don't think the appetite is there around the world. It's certainly not there in the United States to buy that. So it's going to be the Fed. And where does the Fed get the money to buy the bonds? Well, it creates inflation. It prints money. And, by the way, New Zealand is where the whole 2% inflation target got started.
That's right.
But it didn't get started as a target. That was a perversion. The way it got started is when they reformed, in the Roger Douglas era, and they went through these market-based reforms. The rule that was put in place was a 2% inflation ceiling. It wasn't a target. It wasn't like try to hit this target to win. It was stay beneath the ceiling and you win. So if inflation was 1%, that didn't mean that they needed to go up another percent. It just meant that they were okay, that they were below the target. And the further below the target, the better. So if you were at 0.5%, that was better than being at 1%. But other central banks eventually perverted this whole concept to make it a target of inflation. Like you need 2%. That 1% isn't enough. But that was never part of what New Zealand did. They never said that we needed 2% inflation. They just said if we get 2%, that's too much. It needs to be less. 2% was the upper end of what they would tolerate for inflation. But it became the target, and now it's really a floor. Now they don't want it to go below 2%. It went from a ceiling to a floor. But we're nowhere near the floor, and I don't think we're going to get anywhere close to it because there's so much inflation in the pipeline. And New Zealand, fell into this because all the world's central banks were saying, "Oh, we're below target. We need more inflation," and they kept creating it and creating it. Well, now they went from too little to way too much.
Yeah.
But I was pointing out in real time. These central banks, like the ECB was the most ridiculous because their supposed target was close to but below 2%. Like they didn't want to actually hit 2%, but they wanted to get as close as they could to it without hitting it. Like it was like the Price is Right or something. They couldn't go over. And so when inflation was 1.7, they were saying, "Oh, we need more. We're still below target. Rates have to stay negative. We have to keep on doing our QE program because we're not close enough to 2. We're only at 1.7. And I was saying back then, how ridiculous this is going to look when they blow through 2%. Like we were printing all this money to nudge the rate up from 1.7 to 1.9, and instead we got 10. Now what do you do? How are you going to bring that? How are you going to put that genie back in the bottle? You can't.
Yeah.
They're not going to see 2% inflation in the Eurozone again. That's a thing of the past. They're not even going to come close.
But it's convenient, though, isn't it? And I guess that speaks to probably like another thing that I don't remember learning this when I did my economics degree, that's for sure. But why is it in our best interest that we have inflation rather than 0 as the benchmark or even negative? Like
Yeah,
why are central banks
it's
so
not. They just made it up. I mean, it's in the government's best interest to have inflation. And so they have to convince the public that it's good for them because that's what they're going to get, inflation, because that's how they give you something for nothing. But inflation is a tax. It's just a tax that the public doesn't realize they're paying. And they actually expect us to believe it. And, we actually do. In fact, the major universities teach this nonsense in their economics departments. What these the government economists say is that if prices didn't go up by a couple of percent a year, nobody would buy anything. The economy would grind to a halt. The only reason we buy stuff is because we think the price might go up. And so we buy it before the price goes up.
Yeah.
But if we didn't know the price was going to go up, we would just not buy anything and the whole economy would implode.
Right. So in theory, we're afraid of our money losing value, so we're more likely to spend it, which creates economic activity. I think that's kind of like the theory, isn't it?
Yeah, but if I know that my money is going to gain value, then I'm more likely to save it. And that is the real engine of economic growth because savings is what finances capital investment. But we haven't had enough savings. But it's preposterous to say that people won't buy things if they have an expectation that the price will go down. Because if people didn't buy things that they thought would get cheaper, nobody would buy cell phones. Nobody would buy computers. Nobody would buy televisions. I mean, nobody would buy any consumer electronics. Why? Because if you just wait, you'll be able to get it cheaper. It's because you don't want to wait. There's a value to having it now. So, do I really want to wait a year to get the phone that I need today because I could get it 2% cheaper? No, I want to get it right now. And I'll hope the price goes down because I know eventually I'm going to buy another one. So I want the price to go down. That's the reason everybody has, giant televisions is because they're cheap. When they first introduced them, they were very expensive and people couldn't afford them. The reason they bought them is because the price came down. So prices going down, is a good thing. And of course, nobody is going to say, I'm not going to eat today because if I wait a couple of weeks, the food I want will be cheaper. So I'm going to starve myself while I'm waiting for the price to go down. No, you buy it because you're hungry, and you hope that the next time you're hungry, the food is less money. I mean, who would want it to be more expensive? Nobody wants healthcare to be more expensive, education to be more expensive, their insurance to be more expensive. Everybody wants stuff to get cheaper, and it's better. Now, the other thing they say is, well, if prices go down, businesses can't make any money. Sure they can. They make more money because their costs are also coming down. So their margins are what is important, not the price. But if prices come down along with costs, businesses can make more money because they have greater volume. Right? The cell phone companies make a lot more money today selling phones at a much lower price than they sold, 20 years ago when the price was much higher, but they hardly sold any units because very few people could afford them. Governments, through inflation, raise prices, and that's a bad thing.
Yeah, that's the fiat financial system in a nutshell right there, right? It encourages mass consumption because your margins really are you're only getting profit if there's a lot of throughput, right? A lot of volume through that. So I agreed what you're saying before, though, around, well, actually interest rates shouldn't be cut. They should actually be increased, but they can't really be increased. So we now kind of have these two camps evolving, the lower and sooner and the higher for longer camp. Mm-hmm. And I kind of want to know, which one wins here? Who's going to win this battle, and at what time frame?
Well, inflation, I think, is going to ultimately overwhelm. The Fed's going to have to surrender. I mean, right now the Fed is still pretending that it's going to be vigilant and it's going to win the inflation battle, no matter the cost. And I think the markets are pretending to believe the Fed. But, it's just a big game of make-believe. But at some point, the pretense is going to be gone because the Fed is going to have to reverse course. It's not going to have to, but it's going to choose to, because choosing not to will be even worse as far as they're concerned. So it's going to go back to money printing. It's going to go back to rate cuts, and inflation is going to take off because it's not going to be cutting rates from a position of having won the inflation fight, but a position of having lost.
So even just talking about it in the sense of a war, well, immediately I'm just thinking, well, it's just really curious just how the financial system and the geopolitical space seem to kind of move in tandem with these matters. Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, Venezuela now. How far can the U.S. go to support Israel now is one of the questions I've been thinking about, because effectively they can't really afford it. And I guess if they're going to lose the battle in the geopolitical sphere and the financial sphere against the battle against inflation, where does that ultimately go?
Yeah, of course, and we have a big problem in the Ukraine that we started. That war never should have even taken place. And the only reason that it continues is because the United States continues to finance it. And where does the U.S. get the money to finance it? Because it doesn't have it. So it's borrowing it, and ultimately the Fed is printing it. So, we're just creating inflation, but it's going to come to an end. The markets are going to force it to end.
So let's kind of go there and go, well, at some sort of time frame, the U.S. reaches the end of the road. They can't keep on printing to repay existing debt. They're losing the battle against inflation. Does that effectively mean the US dollar is losing its reserve currency status? People lose confidence?
I think it will lose that status. Yeah, I think at the end of this process, that status is going to go away. And I think the world is going to resort to, go back to gold as the reserve. I mean, central banks have gold. They all have some amount of gold. They have been increasing their gold holdings. They need to increase them further. But ultimately, the holdings will be revalued in the market as the gold price is priced much higher. But that is a much sounder monetary system based on actual money instead of, just fiat. Because what gives currency value, because it doesn't have any value unto itself, is the money that's backing it up. The problem is right now there's no money backing up any of the currency. It's all dollars, but the dollars have nothing behind it either. So I think the world is going to move back to a sounder monetary system, which will be a benefit for the world, because it will rein in governments. Governments will have to find ways of living within their means.
Well, I want to get more into that, like how you see that playing out in a second. But just 2024 election year, Donald Trump, there's a real chance he could get back into power. So I'm thinking again about these nation state actors making their moves all around the world, causing a little bit of strife here and there. Where does this all go next year in particular? Like, do you think this could come to a head because of an election year in the US next year?
Well, I think the election year is going to put more pressure on the Fed, on Powell, to stimulate, to ease, and prevent any kind of crisis from happening during that election year. And so that's why I think that they're going to go back to QE and potentially cut rates next year. Because, the Fed, despite what they profess to the opposite, it's very political. And the history of the Fed, at least modern history, is that the Fed does what's in the interest of the party that has the White House. And that's the Democrats, that's Biden. The goal of Powell and the Fed is to reelect Biden. So they make that easier if they can prop stuff up. But the problem is inflation is one of the reasons that Biden is so unpopular. And they're not going to solve that problem by creating even more inflation.
That's interesting. Okay. So like just thinking about going back to what would happen if the US dollar did lose its status as the world's reserve currency, thinking about China as the common denominator in a lot of areas in terms of other countries that want to trade with each other. Often it's China might start playing a bigger role there. You mentioned also central banks and gold seem to go hand in hand. So how would it work in practice if there was a change in the US dollar as world's reserve currency to something else? Would it be linked to a basket of goods, or would it be linked, to a basket of currencies or gold? How do you see this playing out?
Well, as I said, I think it makes a lot more sense to remonetize gold. Gold's worked as money in the past, and it would work even more efficiently as money in the future. I think the process of de-dollarization has already started. It's pretty obvious that nations are trying to work out ways to trade with each other without involving the U.S. dollar. You have U.S. dollars that are part of a transaction that doesn't even involve the United States, right? If India is trading with China, why should they be invoicing each other in dollars? I mean, what's the point? The U.S. isn't involved in the transaction at all. So they want to disintermediate the United States, because they don't want to have to be beholden to the United States because they're using our currency. And we made them painfully aware of the inherent risks of being in that position with the sanctions against Russia. I mean, that was a real wake-up call around the world, which was a reason that it was a huge mistake to have done that, to remind the world that they need to get rid of their dollars, because we depend on the world using our dollars for our whole standard of living. We shouldn't have jeopardized that, by calling attention to this the way we did, by punishing Russia the way we did. Yeah, I mean, that accelerated the desire and the impetus to de-dollarize. So it's happening.
And I guess that kind of leads me to my next question is, like, from an investor's perspective, if they're thinking about investing in the U.S. market versus holding gold, either in the physical or through funds. Why gold, and why now? Is it because it's like we're looking at the price, reaching all-time highs recently? Is it because this trend for de-dollarization is increasing? Is that kind of what's driving the gold investment thesis right now?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's driving it yet. I think it will, because I think if that was driving it, gold would already be a lot higher. So I just don't think investors have connected the dots yet. I think they're still, in the dark about this. I think they still have a lot of confidence in the system, in the central banks, in the Fed. And so I don't think we've had the game changer yet. I think there's going to be a wake up. I think there's going to be a moment, a emperor has new clothing type of awakening. And that will, ignite a rush to buy gold. And so then the price, I think, will move up dramatically from here.
Hey, quick message. Hope you don't mind the interruption. Owning physical gold or other precious metals can be pretty cool, but it can be a little bit of a hassle buying it, storing it, and securing it. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, are another option where you can own gold. You get the price exposure to gold without the hassles. But one of the things about gold that people like is about owning something that's outside of the financial system. Really, there's kind of like a need right in between an option of owning a bit of gold that you knew that existed somewhere without having to worry about security. Well, a couple of weeks back, I came across Goldie, and it's a new New Zealand startup that's making waves in the gold space at the moment by fractionalizing the ownership of a real gold bar. You can own it, you can own a chunk of it, you can own a lot of it if you like, and occasionally you can visit it. I caught up with the co-founder of Goldie just this week, actually, to learn a little bit more, because I'm intrigued about these things. I think they might be onto something here. Gold might just be the beginning too. Finally, here's an option where you can own some gold without the stress. Want to learn more? Do your own research, get some advice, and then check out getgoldie.co.nz. I've popped the link in the show notes just for you. Let's get back to the show.
And all the equities, the gold mining equities that, are continue to have, gold stocks are getting clobbered today, even though the price of gold isn't even down. It's, a little bit below 2,000. But the NASDAQ, the Russell 2000, the S&P, the Dow, they're all at 52-week highs today. So, everything is awesome as far as the mainstream investors are concerned, and even the big boys, Wall Street investors they're completely whistling past this graveyard.
We're in a bizarro world still, right? Okay, so now before we started record, I was vaguely aware of this happening in the background, and you brought it up as well. So I just want to understand a little bit more of the story, just from your perspective around what's happened recently with this lawsuit that you've won with 60 Minutes in Australia. And amongst others, I'm trying to understand what went on there. And can you just start by giving me the overview of that story?
Yeah, well, the reason you don't know about it is there is a deliberate effort on the part of the mainstream media down under to cover this up. Now, I know why Channel 9 wants to cover it up, because I exposed them as complete frauds. And so they want to cover it up. But why do their competitors want to cover it up? Nobody is covering this story. And in fact, the way Channel 9 is trying to spin it is as if they didn't even lose. They've been claiming that it was settled, and so they didn't lose. They didn't settle it. They lost, and they lost badly. I beat them 7 times in a row. I got 7 consecutive judgments against them in a federal court in Australia, because everything they kept saying was ruled to be a bunch of BS. And so rather than lose an 8th time, right, because the only thing that it had come down to by that point, after they lost 7 times in a row, the only issue left to decide was how big the check was going to be that they were going to have to write me. That everything else was already decided by the judge. So only when we got to that point did they say, okay, we surrender, we give up, we'll consent to you getting the maximum amount of money you could possibly get, right? And at that point, I was like, all right, I guess I got to accept your surrender. Because if I didn't accept their surrender, they threatened to use that against me later on by saying, hey, we offered to surrender and give him everything. He didn't take it, and he made us spend more money on lawyers. You need to make him pay our legal bills. So to avoid having to pay their legal bills after they surrendered, I accepted their surrender. I said, okay. And so what they did is they told the judge, we lose. We consent to you issuing a judgment against us for the maximum is actually 460,000. So they gave me 550,000 Australian dollars. And they said, we'll pay all his costs. And they consented to judgment against everybody, which was 5 respondents. I sued the Age, 60 Minutes, Nick McKenzie, Charlotte Grieve, and then the producer, Joel Tozar, of the 60 Minutes segment. So all 5 of them surrendered, and all 5 of them were ordered to pay me. But they're trying to pretend that they didn't lose because they settled. They didn't settle. It's like I had them in a chokehold in the octagon, and they tapped out because they were about to pass out, and then they claimed that they settled the match by tapping out. Like they lost.
What happened though that led to this outcome? Because it involved the bank, right?
Okay, so here's the backstory. The government. And I haven't been able to get all of the pieces because the reporters, are bearing the evidence and protecting their corrupt sources. But somebody, either in the U.S. government at the IRS or maybe at the Australian ATO, somebody told Nick McKenzie and Charlotte Grieve that my bank was being investigated in this joint investigation called Operation Atlantis from the J5. They didn't even tell me I was being investigated. Apparently, they told the reporters, but they never told me, right? So anyway, they told these reporters, and they leaked them, selective pieces of information, about bank customers that were at the bank, right? And a couple of them, 2 or 3, had some criminal records, right? And so they then took this information and embellished it. And misreported it. And in fact, through discovery, because I only got this information because I sued, I got the actual notes of the conversations that took place between these reporters and people they interviewed for the stories, which would be former customers of the bank, former employees of the bank, referral agents. And everybody they talked to, without exception, told them how strict my bank's compliance was, that it was like over the top, like it was more stringent than any bank that they had ever experienced, that compliance was so bad to the point of being annoying, to being a pain in the butt, where people were not using the bank because there was too much regulation, right? So they had all this information, and they didn't have any information regarding any criminality, any criminals using my bank, any tax evaders. So they came out and they did this story. And they accused the bank of laundering money for criminals, of having a huge clientele of organized criminals, of drug traffickers, helping people launder money to evade taxes. They said we didn't do any compliance. They misquoted people. They doctored their own evidence. They took stuff out of context, and they totally fabricated a lie, and they passed it off as actual journalism when it was just political fiction. I put this interview they did of me, and the fraud starts from the beginning because the reporter, Charlotte Grieve, right? She contacted me. She's this reporter from The Age. And she said, hey, I've come across Peter Schiff on the internet. We're interested in his views on gold and inflation or the economy. Could we interview him? And so on that basis, they arranged an interview. Well, when I get there, she's not even there. She was the one that was supposed to interview me. I get there, there's this other guy, Nick McKenzie, there. And, I even asked Nick McKenzie, hey, Nick, so what did you want to talk to me about? He goes, well, I'm going to talk to you about the economy and how it affects Australia, So then we start the interview. He asked me like 1 or 2 questions about the economy, and then immediately starts talking about my bank, and then accusing me of using my bank to help criminals launder money and evade taxes. And I'm like, whoa, what the hell? This is not the topic that you asked me to discuss, but I discussed it with him for almost an hour. But I kept telling him, look, stop asking me questions about the bank. I don't work at the bank. I can't really give you these answers. And this interview is not supposed to be about the bank. That's not what I agreed to. So, let's stay on topic, right? But anyway, they took that 50-minute interview and edited it completely out of context. Because at the end of the interview, I finally was like, okay, look, that's it. I'm done with this. You keep asking me these questions. I've told you to stop. I've told you to move on. I've answered your questions. I'm just ending the interview. And I take off my mic and I leave. And that became the whole focus of the whole piece. They started the piece with me taking off my mic. They ended it. They made it look like I had something to hide, that I was guilty. And and they created this 60 Minutes episode, which was ruled defamatory. They've now removed it from the internet. But the minute they showed this doctored interview, and it wasn't just me. I've spoken to other people who they've interviewed, and I got the real interviews. And they lied about everything. They take everything out of context, and they misrepresent what they're actually told, right? So what you see, and this is on 60 Minutes, what you see on this program can't be believed. It is not news because the reporters are not honest. They are not presenting their actual findings of what they have purported to investigate. They twist whatever they found to justify the conclusion they made before the investigation began. See, they decided that my bank wasn't following the rules, that we weren't doing our compliance, we weren't doing Know Your Customer, weren't doing KYC. But when all of their evidence proved that their initial premise was wrong, instead of accepting that they were wrong and just moving on, they're like, well, we don't care. We're just going to pretend the evidence confirms what we thought, even if we have to lie about what we found, which is what they did. But so the interview, after they aired this thing on 60 Minutes, I was demanding that they showed my whole interview. I was like, look, just show the people what I actually said. Don't show them what you're pretending I said. Show them what I actually said. And they refused. Part of the lawsuit and part of the reason I sued them and spent, close to $1 million Aussie dollars, right, which they have to pay me back now. But one of the reasons I did that was to get that video, which I have since put on the internet. You can go to my YouTube channel, right, and see the video, the whole 50 minutes. I even included the beginning where I asked him, what's the interview going to be about? And he lies to me and says it's going to be about the global economy, right, before he ambushed me on the bank. Because none of that stuff I said about the economy made it onto 60 Minutes. That was all part of the lie to kind of catch me off guard. It was in the Age article. It said, when we caught up with him at his home and asked him about his bank, his guard was down. I mean, my guard wasn't down, but they did what they could to lower my guard by lying to me. I'm going to be suing the Age again and 60 Minutes for injurious falsehood because I identified at least 40 plus individual statements that were made that were actually false. And not just false, but that the reporters knew the statements were false at the time they made them. After I won the case, and I tweeted, or didn't tweet, I posted on X that I was going to release this video of the unedited broadcast. The lawyers for 60 Minutes went to court. They filed an emergency order to try to hold me in contempt, and they wanted a judgment to prevent me from showing the unedited video. And the lawyer for the 9 Network said that the public should not be allowed to see the inner workings of a broadcaster. So the public can't see the truth, just the lies that we choose to tell them, right? That's it. That they can't see the actual interview, only the way we cut it and slice it up. That's all they're allowed to see, right? You can't see how the sausage is made. Just eat it, right? But they actually lost that. They actually had it. And what happened, it was funny because the judge said, that was a good judge, this guy, Hugh Jackman's brother, not to undercut him because he's successful in his own right, but people know who Hugh Jackman is, Wolverine. This is his brother. I liked him. He was a good guy. But he told them, he said, are you sure you want to go down this road? Because, if I rule on this, it could be very embarrassing. It could hurt the reputation of your 2 reporters. So why don't you check with them before you proceed? And then after that, they withdrew the whole thing. And then they were ordered to pay my costs again. So in a way, that represented my 8th win against them, right? Because before I had 7 wins in a row, this would be win number 8. But the bottom line is the whole thing is a fraud. And it's amazing that this is not getting out there, because Channel 9 is a major network in Australia, and probably a lot of people in New Zealand watch it. 60 Minutes is a big news show, in quotes, news.
Yes.
This guy, Nick McKenzie, 2 days after he lost the defamation suit, he won an award, a big award in Australian journalism, and they named an annual prize, a grant, where every year somebody's going to get $10,000 for the Nick McKenzie Award for investigative journalism. That's like giving Bernie Madoff, right, an asset manager award in the name of Bernie Madoff, or coming up with a crypto pioneer award in the name of Sam Bankman-Fried, right, or maybe having an award named after Harvey Weinstein, or I mean, it's just so ridiculous. The guy is a fraud. He lied. He deliberately distorted the truth. And what's really bad is Charlotte Grieve won in 2021. This company, Citi in Australia, they have these annual journalism awards. She won the award for excellence in journalism, best young journalist of the year, specifically for the 60 Minutes program, Operation Atlantis, that was ruled defamatory, was removed from the internet, and where she was ordered to pay me $550,000 for defaming me. Now, I've tried to contact that Citi and say, hey, wait a minute. You gave an award to this reporter for a broadcast that was actually defamatory, and they had to take the whole thing down. Are you going to rescind your reward? Are you going to ask Ms. Grieve to return that award that was given to her for excellent journalism? Or does Citi regard defamation as excellent journalism? Because to me, that's the lowest form of journalism. That's the worst thing you can do as a journalist. I mean, how often does a journalist lose a defamation lawsuit? It's pretty rare. It's hard. There's freedom of the press. They have a long leash. You have to really go above and beyond, right, to lose a defamation case. And that's what happened. She lost this case, and lost it badly. I beat the crap out of her and Nick McKenzie. They had nothing. They didn't have a shred of evidence. Their case was so weak that the judge threw it out 3 times in a row. But if they didn't have any evidence, why did they make the accusations? Why did they accuse me of laundering money and of evading taxes and doing all this bad stuff without a shred of evidence that I actually did it?
Why then? Yeah. So, in your opinion, why do you think this all went down? Because clearly it was based on some allegations that later on proved to be, correct me if I'm wrong, unfounded. But
right, but they shouldn't have even reported that I was under suspicion. Because what if it turned out I was innocent? Because they destroyed my whole bank. I lost tens of millions of dollars. What I'm getting for winning the defamation suit doesn't even come close to making me whole on what this whole thing cost me. I mean, if they had any integrity, they just would have kept their mouth shut and waited for the investigation to run its course. And then if they charged me with something, okay, do your report. But they ended up accusing me of stuff that not only did I not get convicted of, I didn't even get charged with it, because there wasn't any evidence to even charge me, let alone convince a jury that I actually did it. But to answer your question, what was the reason they did it? I think it was politics. I think they support more government and more regulation in Australia, more anti-money laundering. They wanted to get more regulations on accountants and lawyers and realtors. And to do that, they wanted to create this phony situation and use my bank as the example. And that, of course, they're very liberal. In fact, they're only, or not liberal, just, socialists. Their only defense, and Judge Jackman kept nailing them on this, but they kept saying, what's your evidence that Peter Schiff is helping criminals evade taxes? So, well, he believes in low taxes. He thinks taxes are too high and they should be lower. He thinks that people should try to minimize their taxes. So, he doesn't like big government. He thinks government is corrupt. It's like, so it was all because of my politics. That was their whole argument against me. He's guilty because he's a conservative or he's a libertarian. That was it. That's all they had. And the judge is like, well, you can't make that leap. But that's the leap that they made. I am revealing a cancer in Australian journalism, but I can't remove it. The people in Australia have to do something for themselves. I've just given it to them on a silver platter. See, the problem is most of the people they defame and lie about don't have the resources to fight them. And so they get away with it. Well, I had the resources. I fought them. But they're still getting away with it because the money they paid me is nothing. This is a major publicly traded corporation, right? So it's a parking ticket. We need the public to be made aware that they lost. This is a fascist situation where you have this unholy alliance between corruption in the media and corruption in government. Because the government officials who leaked this information to the reporters were corrupt because the leaks were illegal. They're not supposed to leak the target of the investigation.
It's definitely something like I didn't bargain for that story. Like that's quite full on. So what you're suggesting is like that this allegation was turned into basically a trial through the media, which was effectively a witch hunt.
The bank ended up losing so much money based on the bad publicity that regulators shut it down because it didn't have enough capital left. But I think there was a lot of pressure by the media and the IRS to shut it down so they could make an example of how tough they are on money laundering and tax evasion. Because everybody thought my bank was helping people launder money and evade taxes because the media had accused it of that there was pressure to shut it down, to show that money laundering and tax evasion wouldn't be tolerated. Nobody in the government wanted to stand up and say, wait a minute, these allegations are false. They're not doing that. The bank isn't doing that. We've investigated them, and we didn't find any evidence of that. They found nothing. Nobody at my bank was charged with anything. Nobody was fined at all related to money laundering or tax evasion or any of that stuff. And to my knowledge, not a single customer. We had thousands of customers. And by the way, they put my bank into receivership. It's been almost 18 months, and nobody's got a nickel. Nobody's got their money. All the money is there. My bank was 100% reserved. We didn't make any loans. And in fact, in the 16 months from when the articles came out in Australia and when the local regulators put the bank in receivership for being undercapitalized, 75% of the customers' deposits were withdrawn by the customers, over $200 million, and every nickel was sent out the day it was requested. I had no problem. What bank in the world could have a run where 75% of the money is withdrawn and they just send it out, no problem? I had no problem because we didn't make any loans. And we could have sent out the other 25% if the government hadn't prevented us from doing it. And it all started based on the media. Had 60 Minutes Australia, had The Age, and they also teamed up with the New York Times, so they got their blood on their hands too. But if it wasn't for this media event, nothing ever would have happened. Nothing. My bank would be thriving today. It would be much bigger, even more successful. I'd be making a ton of money. All the customers would have all their money, access to all their money. Nobody would have been inconvenienced. Puerto Rico would be doing great because they'd be collecting a lot of taxes from my bank, from all the employees and profits, and we would be generating economic activity here in Puerto Rico. I think we would have been the crown, the jewel in the crown of Puerto Rican banking. Instead, the whole banking industry has been destroyed based on the false connection between my bank and money laundering and tax evasion. To this day, the stigma is still out there. People still think that my bank was facilitating money laundering and tax evasion, even though it wasn't. This was the biggest criminal investigation of tax evasion and money laundering in the world. 5 governments combined together, combined resources. And they went through my bank with a magnifying glass. We provided hundreds of thousands of documents on thousands of accounts, and they couldn't find anything wrong with one. Not one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that, and this will definitely be part of it. So we've covered a ton of ground today. And so I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much,
Oh, my
Peter.
pleasure.
If people want to follow you, obviously you've got the Peter Schiff Show. I'm going to put links all over the show notes so people can follow you. But what else would you recommend if people want to follow you? Twitter, perhaps?
Yeah, well, follow me on Twitter. I've got or X. I keep saying Twitter. Follow me on X. Used to be Twitter. I've got almost 1 million followers, so I try to put some good stuff out there. But I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. You can find the real Peter Schiff. You'll find me out there.
Cool. No, I really appreciate it.
And,
Yeah.
my asset management company, we manage money. I mean, the bank is gone, but I still, help people all around the world manage their portfolios. So check out Euro Pacific Asset Management. And I sell precious metals. I mean, we're in, I don't know whether we're really dealing in New Zealand yet through Schiff Gold, but my goal is to expand all over the world. I just recently reacquired Schiff Gold. I had sold it about 7 years ago to Gold Money. I bought it back. And one of my goals is to really grow the business and make it more of a worldwide retailer of physical precious metals, not just here in the United States.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks again, Peter. It was really awesome to be able to speak to you, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.
Okay. Take care.
All right. Thanks for listening into the Everyday Investor Podcast. Like what you've heard, but you want more? Make sure that you've subscribed to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the Everyday Investor newsletter too. The links for everything are found in the show notes that you can access easily by swiping or tapping over the cover art in your podcast player. If you received value in some way, I'd love it if you could take the time to write a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Share it with a friend, or think of our show partners where appropriate. Easy Crypto, the safe and easy way to buy and sell crypto in New Zealand. Gorilla Technology, increasing business success through innovative and strategic IT solutions. And Ungaro & Co. Financial advice for everyday people building everyday wealth. Remember, some investments or strategies discussed on these episodes may result in financial loss. Be sure to do your own research and ideally seek qualified advice of your own before making investment decisions. Hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll catch you next time around.